All right, welcome everyone. I think I'd seen the guest list beforehand, and I think a lot of you are familiar with who I am, but I am a senior systems consultant here at Now Micro. Switch over to the next slide. I've been doing consulting work here at Now Micro for more than 10 years now. My focus has been on assisting our clients with systems management, using tools like Configuration Manager, Intune, and Windows Autopilot, which is what we're going to be talking about today. If you have any questions for me that don't get answered during today's presentation, you can reach out to me directly on Twitter, or I've listed my email there, or if you reach out to any of the sales staff at Now Micro, they can get the question filtered my way as well. As I mentioned, I work for Now Micro. We're based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and have been around since 1993. We operate in a variety of markets and assist customers with many different services. We provide hardware solutions that range in variety from Windows workstations to Chromebooks to digital signage and IoT devices. We also offer professional, technical, and engineering services. Finally, we have our DICE product, which offers asset management capabilities and even some systems management features. If you'd like more information about anything we cover in the presentation today, don't hesitate to reach out. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk about the basics of Intune and Autopilot. I'll walk through a basic Autopilot deployment process. After that, I'll cover some other features that can tie in with Autopilot, namely hybrid Azure AD join and co-management. And finally, my colleague Michael will talk more about our DICE solution and how it can help augment your Intune and Autopilot environment. So the main goal that we're trying to achieve by using Windows Autopilot is to deploy a Windows 10 device to an end user. And when we talk about deploying Windows devices, we can break the options down into two categories: traditional Windows deployment and modern Windows deployment. Traditional Windows deployment is a process most of you are likely very familiar with. For years, the best method of getting Windows devices ready for end users was to build a custom image. Things like drivers, applications, settings, and customizations would be pre-configured in an image or task sequence. When a new Windows device was purchased, it would be delivered to the IT department, the device would be unboxed and then imaged using that custom image. The process would completely overwrite the Windows OS that came preloaded on the device. When we start talking about deploying hundreds or even thousands of devices, this could become a very time-consuming and costly process. So modern Windows deployment is a new option for deploying devices to end users. Instead of overwriting that existing Windows OS with a pre-configured image, we would use tools like Intune and Autopilot to configure that existing OS or provision it. This means that the IT department may never need to actually touch a newly purchased device. Instead, all of the apps, settings, and customizations that the device needs can be pre-created in Intune. The new device can then be shipped directly to the end user. The user turns on the device, connects it to the internet, and the device begins to automatically provision. After a short amount of time, the user will be signed in and the device will be ready for use. And actually, before I go to this slide, let's go back to the other. So we talked about this is how you can deploy modern devices, and there is benefits to doing it this way over the traditional deployment. So modern Windows deployment, it helps with managing like a modern workforce, the new way people are working, right? So the trend of employees that have been working outside of your normal office setting had already been growing before the pandemic started, and then the events of the past year have really only accelerated that trend. Modern deployment with Autopilot allows us to deploy devices to users without ever needing to touch those devices, and we can even re-image those devices through like an Autopilot reset. And then once those devices are deployed, we can just manage them through Intune as long as they have an internet connection. That sounds like a great solution. Let's take a little bit more of a detailed look here at how it works. So the first step happens when devices are purchased and arrive in the warehouse at Now Micro. The devices are unboxed and brought into the production area. Our DICE tool is run on each device to collect all of the relevant asset information. The next step is to upload the device information to Autopilot. The information collected from the devices by DICE is fed into an upload tool. This tool connects to the customer's Azure tenant, populates their Autopilot device list with the newly purchased systems. After the devices have been uploaded to the customer's tenant, they are then able to assign an Autopilot deployment profile along with various other settings and applications. Finally, the device is shipped directly from Now Micro to the end user. When the user receives the device, all they need to do is power it on and connect it to the internet. The device will ask them to sign in with their Azure credentials and then automatically provision with all of the previously assigned settings and applications. So now that we have an overview of how the process works, I want to dig into each section a bit more detail. But before that, I want to cover a few of the prerequisites that you'll need before implementing the process. So the first prerequisite to talk about is everyone's favorite, which is licensing. Autopilot uses features from both Azure Active Directory and Microsoft Intune, so you'll need to be licensed for both of those products. And the required licensing for those can be attained through one of these options here. So you can see there's a bunch of different options for whether you're government or education or enterprise, but you need to have some combination of this licensing in order to be able to do Autopilot. The other important thing to remember is that after the licenses have been purchased, they need to be assigned to the users that will be using Autopilot provision devices. For more information about the licensing requirements, you can refer to the Microsoft Docs page. They do a pretty good job of breaking it down. The other prerequisite to keep in mind is the Windows operating system itself. In order for a device to use Autopilot, the installed operating system must be one of these editions. Note that this list does not include Windows 10 Home Edition, so you can't do Autopilot from a machine that's starting off at Windows 10 Home. You need some build of Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise or Education. You can also use the long-term servicing build. Additionally, Autopilot does not support Windows builds that are beyond their support lifecycle. So, out of date, old feature updates, you'll want to be on some sort of supported version of Windows when you're doing Autopilot. And again, for more information about the requirements, refer to the Microsoft Docs page. So now that we've got the prerequisites out of the way, I want to walk through the basic Autopilot deployment process. There are four main steps to the Autopilot deployment process: registering the devices, assigning a deployment profile, assigning settings and applications, and then finally deploying to devices. So first up, let's look at the first step, registering devices. So registering devices with Autopilot involves collecting unique hardware information from a device and then uploading that hardware information in the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center, which you may also know as the Intune portal. This task can be accomplished in a variety of ways. For new hardware purchases, the vendor can automatically upload the hardware information on behalf of the customer through the Microsoft Partner Portal, which is a service we offer at Now Micro. Alternatively, the vendor can provide the customer a list of devices with the required hardware information in a CSV file. The customer can then manually upload that CSV file in their Intune portal. For existing devices, the hardware information can be collected using tools like Configuration Manager or Now Micro's own Dice Live agent. That data can then be put into a CSV format and uploaded into the Intune portal. There's also a PowerShell script called get-Windows Autopilot info. This script can be used on an individual device to automatically collect the required hardware information and then upload that information directly into your Intune tenant. So exactly what kind of hardware information is required to register a device with Autopilot? When manually uploading devices, the two required pieces of information are the device serial number and the hardware hash. Once this information is gathered, it must be put into a CSV file before being uploaded. The CSV file must have the following header information: device serial number, Windows product ID, and hardware hash. Those are the three required columns. There's also optional columns there for group tag and assigned user, which I'll talk about in a minute. So yeah, again, the only required fields, the only required headers are hardware hash, serial number, and Windows product ID, but you only actually have to fill out device serial number and hardware hash. So really the two pieces of info you need are the device serial number and the hardware hash. And again, both of those values can be collected by tools like Configuration Manager and Dice, but you can also pull the information directly from a system using PowerShell. I've included a few example PowerShell commands at the bottom of this page to get both pieces of hardware or information. And then, as I mentioned, the example CSV header that I have there has some additional columns. So group tag column is useful for identifying devices. When you upload or register a device with Autopilot, you can optionally assign a group tag. And this can be whatever you want. We could have, assign the PO number of the purchase to the group tags. You can kind of track devices that way. or the group tag could maybe be set to the business unit that the devices are going to be going to. And then that group tag can be used later to help break devices into different groups for assigning different settings and apps to them. And then the assigned user column is for if you wanted to pre-assign a user to a device. So if you knew a specific device was going to be going to a specific user, you could pre-assign it to that user. And then when they boot the device up, it would have their username pre-populated in there. So they wouldn't have to type that in. All they'd need to do is put in their password. The other thing I mentioned before was the get Windows Autopilot info script. So this script is really useful when you're working with individual devices or doing deployment testing. The script can automatically collect the device hardware information and upload it directly into your Intune tenant when it's run with the online parameter. Alternatively, it can write information to a CSV file when it's run with the output file parameter. And then there's a few other notable parameters. Append will just add on to the end of an existing CSV file instead of overwriting it. The group tag and assigned user parameters, again, just allow you to assign a group tag or assigned user to a specific device row. So let's take a quick demo of the registering devices. So I've got a couple of windows here. This first one is just a PowerShell window on my own machine where I've got the get Windows Autopilot info script downloaded. And I'm just going to run it with the -output file switch, which should collect the information from my machine and put it into a CSV file. So I run that and it puts it on my desktop. Go find that and open it up here. And you can see it created a CSV file with the device serial number, product ID, and hardware hash headers up at the top. And then so this is like a default string is the serial number. It didn't collect a Windows product ID, which is fine. And then this big long string is the hardware hash, which is the main important thing that we care about. So now that I have this CSV file, I could go out to my Intune portal, go under devices, enroll devices, and under the Autopilot program down here, go into devices. And then from here, I could say I want to import. And then I just browse to that CSV file. It validates that my rows are formatted correctly. And then if I hit import, it would make a device record in here for my device. The other way of running this script is with the online parameter. So this is a machine that's just, a freshly imaged Windows 10 machine that's at the out-of-box experience. I can do Shift F10 to get a command prompt. PowerShell to change that into a PowerShell prompt. Change the execution policy so that I can run scripts. And then install the get-windows get Windows Autopilot info script. So this will reach out to the PowerShell gallery where the script is published and just download it to this machine. And they'll take a second here. It's just got to update some of the built-in PowerShell providers on the machine. All right, so once that's all done, I can then run get-windows Autopilot info, and I can run it with the -online parameter. So what this will do is just reach directly out to my tenant and upload the device information for me, so I don't have to do that extra step of running a CSV file. So it installs the PowerShell module that's used to talk to Intune. And live demo here, by the way, too, so, fingers crossed. So shortly, I should get prompted to enter my credentials for my tenant. There we go. And two-factor authentication, which everyone has set up, right? So there we go. It says it connects to my Intune tenant. It gathered the device details of the system. and it's now waiting for that system to be imported. So we can come back to that later. We're going to walk through deploying this machine fully, but we'll just let that go in the background. So back over to our presentation. So we've got the device registered. The next step now is looking at a deployment profile and the enrollment status, so kind of the look and feel of the Autopilot process. So a deployment profile is a set of options that instructs the device on how to behave during the Autopilot process. The main choice in a deployment profile is what deployment mode to use. So the first deployment mode is user-driven. In this mode, the out-of-box experience prompts the user to sign in with their Azure AD credentials. The device is then configured for that user account. So this is the most common deployment mode that you'd be using in Autopilot and would generally be used for all of your normal end user devices. The second deployment mode is self-deploying. In this mode, there's no need for a user to sign in. Instead, the device will automatically run through the out-of-box and configure based on settings and applications that have been assigned to the device object. This mode is ideal for if you're using shared use devices like kiosks or maybe digital signage devices. The next option down on the list is whether the system should be Azure AD joined or hybrid Azure AD joined, and we'll talk more about that later in the presentation. Next set of options control which out-of-box experience screens are presented to the user. So things like selecting the language, the keyboard layout, accepting the license terms, picking privacy settings. You can have all of those screens optionally show up or just be hidden if you want to pick the settings ahead of time. And then the next thing is the user account type. So this setting controls whether the user account is in a user-driven deployment should be a local admin or a standard user. So for most cases, obviously, I'd recommend not giving users administrator rights. Generally, I want that to just be standard user. Next option down is the white glove out-of-box experience. So I want to note that this option recently was renamed and is now known as Autopilot pre-provisioning. So if you still see white glove stuff around, know that that's been renamed to pre-provisioning. This option allows some of the Autopilot process to be done ahead of time. So a device would be booted up, but no user account would sign in. Instead, the device would be preloaded with all the device assigned settings and apps in the background. Then the device could be turned off and shipped to the user. And when the user boots up the system, they would only need to wait for the specific user settings and apps to apply, which would help speed things up. So this is something that could be done, say, at Now Micro before being sent out to a user, or you could have the devices shipped to like your tech department and do the white glove or pre-provisioning there and then send them out to users. But definitely can help speed things up a little bit. And then the final option allows for specifying a device name template. So in my example over here, I've just got it set to NM-serial number. So it'll name every computer, prefixed with NM for Now Micro dash, and then just the serial number of the machine. Generally a good way to identify the devices. So assigning a deployment profile. So now that we have the deployment profile, how do we get it assigned to devices? And the answer is by using Azure Active Directory groups. So the easiest way to handle this is to create a dynamic Azure AD group that'll automatically populate with all of your Autopilot registered devices. This solution is nice because it doesn't rely on us having to manually edit the group membership each time a new Autopilot device is registered. I've listed the query here in bold that you can use on your dynamic group. And again, that'll create an Azure AD group that is automatically populated with any Azure AD Autopilot registered device. So you could name the group something like all Autopilot devices. If you needed to, if you had multiple different profiles, you could optionally create like additional AD groups with just static membership for like the, your self-deploying machines or something. Or if you need to have, larger groups of machines that need different deployment profiles, looking to maybe like creating dynamic collection memberships based off of group tag. But takeaway here is you assign a deployment profile to devices through an Azure AD group. And then we have the enrollment status page. So the deployment profile is created and assigned, and that's going to control how Autopilot functions. The next step is to customize how Autopilot looks. So this can be done by modifying the enrollment status page. The options here allow us to control what type of information is displayed to the user during the Autopilot process. We can also configure settings around error handling and even choose which kind of tasks the autopilot process should wait for before the user signs in. So let's take a quick demo of what those settings look like in the console and where you can find them. So back in my Endpoint Manager Admin Center, if I go to Devices, again, and Enroll Devices, under Windows Autopilot down here, we've got Deployment Profiles, which is the first thing I was talking about. So there's a number of different profiles here. I can click into one that's like already been created. This is the standard one I've been using at Now Micro. If we look at the settings here, we can see it's set up as a user-driven deployment mode. So the users will be asked to log in during Autopilot. We're just doing Azure AD joined only, not hybrid Azure AD joined. We're hiding the license terms, hiding privacy settings, hiding the account options, setting users up as non-admin users. In this case, we're not doing white glove or pre-provisioning, but you could do that. Language is English. We're automatically configuring the keyboard and then applying a device name template, so an M-serial. And then we can see that this deployment profile has been assigned to the group Intune-all autopilot devices. So if we go over and look at our groups, see we have a bunch of Intune groups, and here's our all autopilot devices group. And if we look at the group membership, the dynamic membership rules, there we go. So there's that same query that I was talking about before, right? So that query on the group will automatically pull in all of your autopilot registered devices. And then the other piece that I talked about was, again, back under Enroll Devices. And then there's the Enrollment Status page. So if we click into the Enrollment Status page and look at its properties, again, we have a bunch more options here. So show app and profile configuration process. I switch that to yes. It kind of shows more detail to the end user. Set a timeout. How long do you want to have the autopilot process go? Like maybe if something's hung in the background, at what point do you just kill it? So I've got 60 minutes in there. Show a custom message when the time limit occurs. So you could have, customize the message that pops up, have them contact your specific IT department or go to a specific, web page to submit a ticket or something. Allow users to collect logs about installation errors. That's a useful one to have so that you can instruct the user on collecting some logs to send back to you for troubleshooting. Only show the devices provisioned by out-of-box experience, block the device until all app profiles have been installed, so don't let the user sign in, allow users to reset the device if so if an error does happen, the user could get a reset button where they can kick it off again and have it try again. Sometimes that's all that's needed to have it be successful. And then this option at the bottom is kind of neat. So block the device until these required apps are installed, if they're assigned. So basically having this set to all is saying any apps that I've deployed to the device, wait for them all to install before the user is able to log into their machine. But what if I have a machine where I have like 15 apps deployed to it or something, right? Instead, I might want to say selected and go through and select like my Microsoft Office app and maybe my Microsoft Edge app, and only wait for those to finish installing before the user signs in. And then anything else that's assigned to them could just continue to install in the background. So there, in this case, I'd only be waiting for Microsoft Office to install. So that's deployment profiles and the enrollment status page, or just a quick look at them. So back over here, the next thing we need to look at then is settings and applications. So having settings and apps isn't actually strictly required for the autopilot deployment process, but it's definitely recommended to have. You're probably going to need to configure some settings and applications about your device, right? So what kind of settings are available to be configured in Intune? Many of the settings you'll configure in Intune will be done using configuration profiles. So a configuration profile allows for changing a wide range of settings on devices. You can think of a configuration profile as being similar to like a group policy object in a on-prem environment. Some examples of things we can do with configuration profiles include changing the operating system version with an edition upgrade, managing Windows 11 for Business, or managing OneDrive settings, or even doing certificate enrollment. In addition to the standard configuration profiles, Intune also has a section devoted to Windows Update settings. So these settings let us control how and when devices get both monthly quality updates and semi-annual feature updates. Intune also contains a section for configuring endpoint security settings. So this lets us manage things around Windows Defender antivirus, BitLocker disk encryption, and the Windows Defender firewall. And then finally, there's compliance policies. Compliance policies isn't something that actually sets any settings on the device. Rather, it reports back on if certain settings, are set, and then you can control access to the environment based on whether a device is compliant or not. So the next step after creating our device setting is to create the applications that our users will need. Excuse me. The first application to look at creating are those that are going to be needed by the majority of your users. So kind of in the same way with your traditional Windows deployment, you'd create like your base apps, your base image apps. You do the same type of thing here in Intune. You'd create your base apps like Microsoft Office, web browsers, your other core business apps, and those would be the things that you want to get down through your Autopilot deployment process. And then Intune could be used to deploy additional apps later on. And then Intune has support for Win32 apps, so the majority of your apps can be deployed using scripts in much the same way that you would probably deploy them with Configuration Manager. Also, as I touched on before, the enrollment status page can be configured to make your Autopilot wait for certain apps to be installed before allowing the user to log in. So again, you maybe build Office, web browser, and a couple of business apps, set those as your required apps, and once those finish installing, let the user log in. If there's additional apps, they can continue installing in the background. So then now that we've created a bunch of settings and policies, or settings and applications, getting them assigned to devices is the next step. And again, the way that the assignments are handled in Intune is using Azure Active Directory groups. So if you're familiar with Configuration Manager, you can think of assignments and Azure AD groups in Intune as being similar to collections and deployments in Configuration Manager, same kind of thing. When creating a new setting or application in Intune, consider if a new group is going to need to be created to assign the object to. Your environment is likely going to contain hundreds or even thousands of Azure AD groups, so it's really important that you use a consistent naming scheme so that you can easily find the groups that you've created. You can see when we were just looking at the groups in my last demo, I had them all prefixed with Intune. But I also like to set up a prefix with something like MEM for Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And after that, I might have a second prefix to denote if the group is for a setting or an application. The exact format of the name doesn't really matter that much. The main thing is that it makes sense to you and that it's consistent. One other thing to note is that Intune does have default groups for all devices and all users. And these groups can be used when you're assigning something that's going to apply to everything. So you might use the all devices group when targeting something like a BitLocker encryption policy, or maybe the Office application install. And we can take a quick look at settings and applications. I'm not going to dive too much into it because we're fairly tight on time today. But again, out in the Endpoint Manager Admin Center, you can go to Windows. And then there's all sorts of different settings here. So we have compliance policies where we can, check, make sure devices are compliant with things like BitLocker and antivirus and being up to date. Configuration profiles. Here we can, create all sorts, like deploy certificates, change all sorts of settings. So I could say create a profile. I want to do a Windows 10 profile from one of the built-in templates. And you can see Microsoft has added a lot of different templates out here for custom, settings that you might want to do. Maybe we want to do like a Wi-Fi profile. I could select Wi-Fi, go next. Say I want to do some enterprise Wi-Fi, and then I could fill out all the information for the wireless network that I want to set up on end users' devices. Once I fill out all that information, I would then assign it out to a group that contains the devices that I want to get that wireless profile. And then when the device runs through Autopilot, it would set up the Wi-Fi profile as part of the Autopilot process. There's also Windows Update settings. I'm not going to go through all the settings, but update settings as well. And then there's a whole other endpoint security section. And then we also have apps. So you can sync store apps into here to deploy, or you can have Win32 apps. So you can see here I've built like Google Chrome as a Win32 app, whereas Microsoft just has built-in things for building like the Microsoft 365 apps. So for example, if I add up here, I can select which type of app I want to deploy, and you can see there's pre-configured templates for like the Microsoft 365 apps or Microsoft Edge. So if I do 365 apps, for example, it kind of, pre-populates that, and then I can configure like, which of the Office apps do I want to install? What other features do I want to have 64 or 32-bit? What kind of activation and licensing should it use? So it's kind of got all that built in. If you're doing something that's not one of these pre-done templates, though, then you'd have to do a Win32 app. So that's where you do add and Windows app Win32. And then here you'd be able to go through and upload your app file and specify the install scripts and everything, your detection method, kind of just like you would do in Configuration Manager. And then once you've created your settings and apps, you'd go to your groups, Intune groups here. So you can see I've created some for like Intune -settings always on VPN, or the Now Micro Wi-Fi profile, or OneDrive settings, and then I put the different groups in there or the different devices in those groups that need the different settings, much like you would do with collections and deployments in Configuration Manager. It just get used to the new terminology, which is groups and assignments in Endpoint Manager Admin Center. Okay. Let's go back to the presentation. So now that we've got kind of everything configured, we've got our deployment profile and everything in place, the next step is actually deploying the device. And the process of deploying the device is really pretty straightforward. So the user would get the device, they power the device on, connect the device to the internet, and then when prompted, they put in their Azure Active Directory credentials. And then the device just goes ahead and it goes through configuring. So I'll show a demo of that enrollment in just a second, but first I wanted to talk a bit about some troubleshooting. So usually the Autopilot process is pretty reliable, but you can run into problems, and a lot of times it gives you a fairly generic error message that can be hard to understand. The internet does have a lot of answers, so if you just go search, usually you can find some good resources out there. But specifically, I wanted to point out the git-autopilot diagnostic script. You would install it much in the same way that I installed that other script in the previous demo. This script is super nice because it'll go through and kind of parse all the Windows logs behind the scenes and give you a detailed breakdown of all the different steps that Autopilot was going through. And if it did fail, it'll give you, an exact name of the thing that failed, rather than like a GUID number, which can be hard to match up to things. So definitely keep this one in your back pocket for troubleshooting installation errors that you run into. Okay, so let's look at a demo of deploying devices. So this device says it's synchronized and uploaded. Let's go see if it showed up in the Intune portal. Let's go back to Windows and Enrollment and Devices. So they'll be identified by serial number, and we see this is the one that I just assigned here, 1763, ending in 67. So the device shows up in the list, and we can see that the profile status is assigned. So once the device is in the list here and the profile is assigned, then that device is ready for Autopilot. So go back over to this device, and I'm just going to do a reboot on it. So this would now be kind of like how the device, imagine we're an end user and the device is shipping to us, and I've just now powered that device on, and I've got it plugged into my network at home. If you don't have an Ethernet to plug in your device, then there'll be a screen when you boot it up where it'll first ask the user to connect to a wireless network. Favorite, just a moment screen. And then the device starts to load into the out-of-box experience. And at this point, it should be reaching out to Azure and checking to see that it's a member of a Autopilot deployment, and it did see that. So now it's going to go ahead and restart the device, and it'll restart it in the Autopilot deployment mode. So again, this device, if we hadn't assigned an Autopilot profile, it would just come up to the out-of-box experience and you would click through it just like a fresh Windows install. And you'd have to create a user account, you'd have to join it to a domain and all that kind of stuff. So now the device is connected to Azure, it's seen that there's a deployment profile assigned to it, and it's now booting up into the Autopilot deployment process. Just a moment longer. There we go. And there we see it's detected that welcome to Now Micro Incorporated. So I would go ahead and enter my information. And again, if we had pre-assigned this device, my username could pre-populate in here. But in this case, I have to enter my username and then password. And then it even does the two-factor authentication right through here. So I'm going to approve that sign-in request. And that should be all I need to do. Now I just need to wait for my device to be provisioned. So it's going to set up, it'll install or apply a bunch of settings, install Microsoft Office and the other couple of apps that I've deployed. And here we've got the details page where we can see it go. So I can show details. It'll kind of give me a breakdown of all the different steps that it's doing behind the scene. And yep, the user waits at this point, and once it's done, they're automatically signed in and they're able to start using their device. So we'll come back and check on that and make sure it successfully finishes. But in the meantime, let's go back over to the slide deck. All right, so now that we've seen what a basic Autopilot deployment looks like, I want to talk about a few other solutions that can tie into your Autopilot deployment process. So often when Autopilot gets discussed, the main deployment scenario that gets covered is the one I just demoed, a fully cloud-managed Azure AD joined device with no connection to a legacy on-prem network. And that scenario is ideally what we'd like all of our devices to be able to do. However, the reality is that many organizations have large chunks of devices that are still reliant in some way on an on-prem network. Fortunately, Microsoft has solutions we can use to be able to cater to those devices. So the two solutions I want to touch on today are hybrid Azure AD join and co-management. I regularly see these two solutions talked about together, and there's usually some confusion about exactly what the purpose of each is. So hybrid Azure AD join is an option for how to provide identity and authentication to a device, while co-management is an option for how to manage a device. So first, let's talk about hybrid Azure AD join. As I said, hybrid Azure AD join is an option for how we provide identity to a device. In the demo I just did, the device was joined only to Azure Active Directory. So this means that Azure AD is the source of truth for that device, and it does not need to look anywhere else. A hybrid Azure AD joined device means that we're joining the device to an on-prem Active Directory, and then also registering that device with Azure Active Directory. But even though it's set up to connect to both locations, this configuration means that the on-prem Active Directory becomes the source of truth for that device. So in order for that device that's hybrid joined to properly authenticate, it needs to be able to communicate with your on-prem domain controller. So if you do hybrid join a device, you're going to need to have some sort of VPN connection on it, preferably an always-on VPN connection that gives that device that link to the on-prem domain controller. So even though you're deploying it with Autopilot, a hybrid device still is going to be, needing that same connection to a domain as your traditional on-prem managed devices. So Ideally, we want to try and avoid a hybrid device if we can. But there's a number of reasons why a device might need to be hybrid joined. So I've listed a few of the more common ones below here. So often organizations have years worth of group policy objects that have been configured. And Microsoft has been rapidly adding more and more settings to Intune, but there are still some settings that exist in group policy and not in Intune. So, if you have those settings, you might need a device to still be hybrid joined to get those group policies rather than the settings through Intune. If you are looking at moving to Intune, I would recommend using it as an opportunity to reevaluate your group policies though, and maybe start afresh. Some of those policies that were set years ago probably don't, actually need to be set anymore. See if maybe you can just do the settings you need with what currently exists in Intune and, ditch group policy altogether. Another common reason for hybrid Azure AD join is printing. So organizations generally have print servers and print software that's set up to only support on-prem devices. If you want a good solution for moving your printing to the cloud, I'd recommend checking out Microsoft's Universal Print solution. Works really smoothly. And then finally, your organization may have some applications that do not support Azure AD. Then maybe they have legacy authentication that only works through an on-prem AD. So some of those, and there could be other reasons too why you still want to hybrid join a device. But again, the goal is Azure AD only if we can. So currently, hybrid Azure AD join is only supported for some Autopilot deployment scenarios. The standard user-driven deployment that I just demoed is supported, and then also supported is the user-driven options for existing devices and when using the white glove or pre-provisioning experience. Unsupported scenarios are when you're using self-deploy or autopilot reset. And Microsoft is working on adding support for these deployment options, but it's just not there yet. So there's a few requirements for hybrid Azure AD join. First, the Intune Active Directory connector needs to be installed on a server on your on-prem network, and that server needs to be 2016 or newer, and must have connectivity to your local Active Directory and must have internet connectivity. So the Intune Active Directory connector kind of works as a proxy between your local domain controllers and Intune. Additionally, the target device must have an Autopilot deployment profile assigned that has a hybrid Azure AD join selected. So the deployment profile we looked at before was set up to just Azure AD join. So we would need to change that or have a separate deployment profile that's set up for hybrid Azure AD join. And then in addition to that, a domain join configuration profile that contains your local Active Directory information must also be assigned to the device. So out in that configuration profile section in Intune, you create a domain join configuration profile and populate your local AD settings in there, and then deploy that out to a group that contains your Autopilot devices that you want to hybrid join. And then finally, the base Windows 10 OS on the target device must be at a minimum version to support the deployment. If we're doing a standard hybrid Azure AD join without a VPN connection, the device needs to be at Windows 10 1809 or newer. And then if we're doing a hybrid Azure AD join with a VPN connection, the device needs to be on a patched version of 1903 or 1909, or just be on version 2004 or newer, which really should be at this point. And then I'll get into the differences between the VPN and non-VPN options in a second. So let's take a look at what the hybrid Azure AD join process involves at just like a high level. So first, the user boots up the device and starts the Autopilot process. The device checks in with Autopilot and sees that the deployment profile that's applied to it is instructing it to do a hybrid Azure AD join. It also sees that there's a domain join configuration profile deployed that provides the information for which domain to connect to. The device then communicates with Intune to start the offline domain join process. Intune communicates with the on-prem environment using the offline domain join connector. Intune then receives the offline domain join information back and then forwards it along to the device. At this point, the device is now domain joined and ready for the user to log in. However, the important thing to note in this scenario is that in order for the domain join to be successful, the device needs to be able to ping a local domain controller directly. So this means that the device, when it's going through the Autopilot, would need to actually be on the same network as a domain controller. So it would need to be like on-prem, where it can physically ping a domain controller. And it'd be much more convenient if we didn't have the requirement for directly connecting to a DC, which is why Microsoft changed that requirement starting with Windows 10 1903. So now when you're creating an Autopilot deployment profile, there's an option that can be selected to skip the domain connectivity check. In its place, you would have to set up some sort of VPN solution, like an always-on VPN solution, that would be deployed to the device as part of the Autopilot process. So this VPN connection would connect automatically and allow the device to have a connection to the on-prem Active Directory to authenticate the first-time user logon. So we would not need that. The device, this could be done at the user's house. We wouldn't need to have it on the network to have that DC connectivity. In addition, if you want to do the VPN option for hybrid AD join, it requires having that VPN solution that can connect while Windows is at a logon screen. So generally, it's going to be something that would authenticate with like a device certificate. So Microsoft's always-on VPN solution works for this, or there's many other third-party VPNs that can be configured in this way. And then you're going to need, if you're doing certificate enrollment, you're also going to need to create a certificate enrollment configuration profile, which that kind of opens a whole other can of worms, but it's definitely something that can be set up. And that's the high-level look at hybrid Azure AD join with Autopilot. So again, if possible, preferred deployment is to use Azure AD only, as there's much less complexity and no requirement for an always-on VPN connection. But if you do need the hybrid functionality, the option is there. And before we go into co-management, I actually want to go just take a look at the hybrid Azure AD join settings out here. So again, if you go back to devices and enroll devices, and we look at our deployment profiles, when we're creating a deployment profile, up here at the top, I have this option for Azure AD join or hybrid Azure AD join. So your deployment profile, you need to have this hybrid Azure AD join option selected. And then here's the option I was talking about where you can say skip AD connectivity check. So if I want to be able to do this hybrid Azure AD join from home and I have the required VPN solution set up, I can flip this setting over to yes. But just know if you don't have the VPN connection set up, then this is not going to work and it's just going to fail. So if you don't have a good VPN that works for that and you want to do hybrid join, you have to leave this at no, and your devices are going to need to be set up somewhere where they can do that initial ping to the domain controller. Okay. So then the last thing I want to touch on is co-management. So co-management is a way of managing a Windows device using both Intune and Configuration Manager at the same time. The idea behind co-management is to allow you to get the benefits of an Intune managed device while still being able to retain some of the management solutions you already have built in Configuration Manager. So this feature makes the process of transitioning to a cloud-based management model much easier. You're able to pick and choose small chunks of management tasks to move into Intune. And this saves you from having to, rebuild all of your stuff that you've already built in config man in Intune and then doing like a cutover. Instead, you're kind of able to slowly move devices into Intune, and even once you've moved them into Intune, then slowly move management workloads to those devices. So it's a really nice kind of in-between state. And this graphic from Microsoft helps to visualize the different management scenarios with co-management. So on one end, you've got local AD join devices that are fully managed by Configuration Manager. And on the other end, you've got Azure AD join devices that are fully managed by Intune. And then in the middle is your co-managed device. It's managed by both solutions at the same time. So some prerequisites to getting co-management set up. First, you obviously have to be licensed for both Intune and Configuration Manager. Second, your Configuration Manager environment must be running version 17.10 or newer, which I hope it is by now, since that's quite old. Third, any device that's going to be co-managed needs to be either Azure AD joined or hybrid Azure AD joined. So you can't co-manage a device that is only joined to an on-prem network. But it is pretty easy to get. So you say you have thousands of on-prem devices and you want to hybrid join them. It's actually pretty straightforward if you use the Azure AD Connect tool, which you're probably already using to synchronize like user identities into your Office 365, say. You can configure the Azure AD Connect tool to also synchronize your device records from local AD, and then check an option to say hybrid join those devices. And then what will happen is the devices will stay joined to your local AD, but they'll also be registered with Azure AD, making them now hybrid joined devices and able to be co-managed. So the way to determine which settings are controlled by which management tool is by configuring the workloads. There's several workloads that control different aspects of device management. Client apps is like our application installations, compliance policies, just checking the compliance of the device. Device configuration is like configuration baselines. Endpoint protection settings, straightforward, that's Windows Defender. Office click run apps, your Office apps. They did have resource access policies in here, but actually this was deprecated with the latest release of Configuration Manager, so you can ignore that one. That one's only in Intune now. And then Windows Update policies. You can have devices get updates from Configuration Manager with WSUS or through Windows Update for Business in Intune. And for more information, more detailed information on that, definitely see the Microsoft Docs. They've got a good breakdown of kind of the detailed, workloads and what exactly is included in each of those. And again, a device could have all of these workloads set to Intune or all of them set to Configuration Manager or any configuration in between. So like, for example, at Now Micro, a lot of our devices are set up in a co-management where they're pointed at Intune for Windows updates, but then they're still pointed at Configuration Manager for a lot of the other stuff. So they're just getting their updates managed through Intune. And then the last thing I want to touch on is the Cloud Management Gateway. So this is a way of extending your on-prem Configuration Manager environment into the cloud. When you implement a Cloud Management Gateway, one or more virtual machines get spun up in Azure. And then on those virtual machines, you install a management point role and a distribution point role. And then devices that are remote, as long as they have an internet connection, can communicate with Configuration Manager through the CMG. So this can also be used for co-management. So commonly with co-management, we're talking about taking our devices that are currently on-prem joined and getting them partially managed by Intune, but it can also work reverse. We can take a device that's gone through Autopilot and is fully Intune managed, and then we can install the Configuration Manager client using Intune, and that Configuration Manager client can talk to the CMG. So we can co-manage a fully Intune device using the Cloud Management Gateway. And where this can be beneficial is if maybe you've used Configuration Manager for years and you've got hundreds of apps set up in there and you don't want to go rebuild those hundreds of apps in Intune. So maybe you rebuild just kind of your core apps in Intune, and then you use the CMG to install the ConfigMan client on your Azure AD joined device. And then now that device has access to your whole library of Configuration Manager apps through the CMG while still being fully Azure AD and fully Intune managed otherwise. So yeah, let's take a look then just real quick at a demo of those. Oh, and we can see my Autopilot device finished here too. So we can see sign in with mine. And there we go. I'm signing in with my user credentials. And then we've got like OneDrive known folder move set up. So automatically all my files are just going to come down to my desktop and my documents, and the apps are going to be installed, and I'll just be ready to use the machine. Back over in Intune here quick, or actually rather Configuration Manager. So co-management settings can be found under administration and cloud services, and then you have co-management. So you would do properties of these settings. And it does take a minute to open up. There we go. So then here you can say, what devices do I want to enroll into Intune? So you could say all devices, and it would just do everything in Configuration Manager, or I could say none, or in my case, I have Pilot. So I have a collection set up. called co-management enrollment, and whatever devices I put in that collection automatically get enrolled into Intune. And then I've got all my workloads configured over here. So again, you can have a workload. You can say, I want this to be, fully configuration manager. Everything should look to configuration manager for this, or fully Intune. Everything should look to Intune for this. But commonly what I'll set up is pilot Intune. And the nice thing about that is it lets me set up collections for each of them. So I can say each one of these collections is tied to Intune. So if I put a device in one of these collections, that workload gets switched to Intune. If I don't have the device in the collection, that workload stays with Configuration Manager. And again, those are just created as like normal collections. So if we go up here and look at co-management, there'd be your list of collections. So put devices in enrollment, they get enrolled. Put devices in, say, Windows Update policies, they start getting Windows Update policies. So really pretty straightforward to set up, just right here in the cloud services section again. And then if you go back out to Intune and look at the devices list, we can see that those devices show up here as corporate. And I've got some devices that are Intune managed, but then a lot of the devices show up as co-managed. So even though they're devices that are in Configuration Manager, I could still go into one of those devices and optionally choose to like remote wipe that device or reset that device or restart that device. So I get access to the nice cloud-based tools from Intune, even on those hybrid join devices. Oh, yeah, two-factor authentication, right. Request, please. There we go. So now I sign in, it finishes doing some last user setup, and then it'll get me to my desktop. But we don't need to wait for that. At this point, that's pretty much everything I wanted to go through. So we can go ahead and turn it over to Michael to do his section of the presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Froehlich. I'm the manager of client services here at Now Micro, and I'm just going to share out my desktop here. Today, I wanted to go over a little bit more on the Autopilot enrollment services that we provide here at Now Micro, as well as go through some DICE demo to kind of show how DICE can complement Intune. So let's make sure. Like John had mentioned, Now Micro does have the ability to upload devices into your Autopilot program. So as devices come through, we can pull out some of that hardware information, upload it to Autopilot, and then from there you can assign it to users, deploy those deployment profiles to the system, and then they'll be ready for users to log in. And then if we combine that with DICE, asset tagging, waste-free delivery, you can save some time and energy by having Now Micro deliver those devices without having your team have to do any more configuration on them. So what I'm going to do is a quick demo. It's going to look similar to what John has already gone over. But in here, I have my Dharma Initiative demo group. And so I have some Autopilot devices that have been enrolled by Now Micro. I can click on this device here and see that I have assigned this to Alex. I have a profile assigned as well. And this is what it looks like when the device gets delivered to Alex. He powers it on. It goes through the out-of-box experience. As soon as he connects to a network, then it's reaching out to Azure, figuring out what deployment profile is on that device. Since I have him assigned to this device, it will pull up and ask for just his password because it's assigned to Alex directly. Some of this has been cut short just for the demo, so it's going through a little quicker than we would normally go through, but we will see here, it's, doing some work in the background, pulling down some of that configuration. And then shortly we'll see it ask for the password. With that deployment profile that we have, we're also deploying the DICE Plus and DICE Complete agent. So as soon as this gets set up and the user gets logged into the device, then that DICE agent is getting installed using Intune and then being imported into our DICE portal, which we'll get to in a second. And so this is what it looks like. You know, it says hello to Alex, puts in his password, and then it will go through some more setup and then log him into the system. From there, we can go into our DICE portal. And this is where we're going to see all the devices that have that agent installed or have gone through Now Micro and had DICE information pulled while it was being in production for services. So on this device here, this is the same serial number that we were looking at before. We have the DICE Complete and DICE Live on here, so we can get a quick look at some information, you know, some operating system, see what software is installed, but then also go in and remote in if he's having issues. So let's say the user gets the device and they're logged in, but now they need something else on there, or there's something wrong with the system. We can now go in, connect in, and run stuff. So let's say we wanted to run something with PowerShell, we get that UAC prompt, and we're able to, you know, troubleshoot their device, install software, etc. And then we're also able to track that asset. So this is a device that has a wireless card in it. And so with that DICE Complete agent, we can actually track the device with pretty good accuracy. So this is sitting right behind me in my office, and we're at Now Micro, and that device is right in this area. All right. So some next steps, if you are interested in using Autopilot services from Now Micro, if you don't have Intune or Autopilot configured, you can contact Tiernan, our services director at tiernanf@nowmicro.com, and he can help you guys get, you know, whether you need to get Intune set up or you have Intune and you just need Autopilot configured, they can help you with that. And if you already have Intune and Autopilot configured, you can contact your account executive or sales at Now Micro to get that added to your orders. And then any other questions, feel free to email myself or sales at Now Micro, and then our website is nowmicro.com. I think we're going to open it up now for any questions. So there is a Q&A section in the webinar. So if you have questions, feel free to add those there, and John or myself will answer those. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're grateful that you're able to make it.
All right, I do see that there's a few questions in here already. So let's just kind of go down the line. So the first question we've got is, if we don't have short-term plans to use Autopilot, but are looking at it in the future as a solution, is it a good idea to have our distributors start registering new devices going forward to be prepared? And I would say that is a good idea. Like, it doesn't really hurt to have your devices registered with Autopilot, because they're not going to do anything unless you actually try to run them through the out-of-box experience. So if you're just, you know, currently imaging devices with like Configuration Manager or something, it's going to just continue operating normally. And then if you ever do decide that you want to autopilot that device, it'll already be registered, and you'll be good to go. So yeah, I would definitely say just start registering devices that you think you might want to autopilot deploy in the future. Let's see, we've got next one. I have a number of legacy and homegrown apps to deploy. Are there any limitations on the type or size of apps that can be delivered via Autopilot? And yes, there is. The most common one I run into, I believe there's still an 8 GB limit on app size. So if you do have some really large apps, maybe like an Autodesk or a SolidWorks, National Instruments, ArcGIS, things like that, that's where co-management with Configuration Manager and the Cloud Management Gateway comes in. You can't maybe build those apps in Intune, but you could still autopilot the device, install the ConfigMan client, and then push out those applications through the Cloud Management Gateway. Let's see the next one here. Is the vendor added method the only way to remotely manage the firmware or BIOS settings on devices? So yeah, I mean, firmware management on the devices is kind of up to the vendors, whatever solutions they provide for that. So like HP has their HP BIOS config utility, Dell has their CCTK or Dell Command Configure, Lenovo's got their Think BIOS config tool. But all of those companies actually do support changing the BIOS and firmware settings directly through PowerShell. So if you don't want to use one of those vendor tools, you can take advantage of the PowerShell commandlets and modify those settings directly through WMI on the machines.
And I can take this next question. Does the location awareness give you a last location for devices that might be powered off as you're looking for their whereabouts? So I'm going to reshare out my DICE portal here, and the answer is yes. So any of these devices that we're doing asset tracking on, we're going to be keeping the last 5 locations right here. So we can see that about every hour I'm getting the new location. This device isn't moving around much, but if it was, let's say I brought this home and, just got into the office, the last location I would have would be, at my house. So if you do have users that they're reporting that their device has been lost, you could go in here and say, okay, well, the last time I saw it was at Starbucks, or I saw it at your house, or it's in your office. And so it gives a good first start on looking for that device.
Next question here, kind of a follow-up to the application limitation one. So would zipping an application to get it underneath 8 gigs be a solution to the 8 gig limit? And that is correct, yes. So it's just 8 gigs of total size. It doesn't really care what the content is that you're uploading. So if you have a big app like an Autodesk or something, you could use like a 7-zip to try and really compress that down into a smaller file. And then upload that, and it would definitely work to get you under the limit. You just need to get under the limit somehow. It's 8 gigs of total size is what you can upload. So the way that the Win32 apps work is basically you build out your content source location, and then you use Microsoft's Win32 content prep tool, which essentially zips up your source location into a .intune win file, and then that .intune win file is uploaded to Azure. So the end result is that .intune win file needs to be less than 8 gigs in size. And then there's another one up here that I passed over before. I missed it. I know it isn't recommended to mix Win32 and line of business apps as it can cause autopilot issues. Do you typically use the all feature most successfully during the enrollment status page? I found multiple apps trying to install simultaneously if I choose to wait until a few are installed. I definitely have run into some weird issues before. So what he's referring to is on the enrollment status page I was talking about, where we could say, maybe we have 15 apps deployed to the device and I want to only wait for Office and Chrome to install. And then I want to let the user sign in and have everything else be running in the background. That can cause some weird issues. I've run into something sometimes before where, like he mentioned, like multiple things are trying to install, or maybe the user's trying to do something like installing an app while another app's trying to install in the background and can cause it to fail. So yeah, for the highest level of reliability, you probably just want to say wait for all apps to install before letting the machine go in. And then that's where, if you do have a lot of apps, the pre-provisioning or white glove becomes useful. Maybe you're getting a device out to somebody where it does sit there for 30 minutes installing apps. You could first boot that device up and have the pre-provisioning do a lot of that app install in the background. And then when you give the device to the user, that's already done, so it'll be a lot quicker for them to log in and get things done. And that's all I see in here for questions at the moment. So if no one else has any questions, or if you didn't want to ask it in the thing today, again, like I said, feel free to reach out to me directly, or Michael, or any of the salespeople here, and we can get your question directed to somebody who can get it answered for you. So yeah, I don't know, Caitlin, if you want to wrap things up.
Yeah, looks like there's no more questions. Like John said, feel free to email. I will be sending out the recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck. But thank you all for attending. All right.
Thanks, everyone.